It all started on a rainy Tuesday morning in late October, 2018. I remember because the wind had this sharp, biting edge that cut right through my coat as I ran up the steps to our old townhouse in Brookline, Massachusetts. The smell of wet asphalt mixed with the faint aroma of roasted coffee from the cafe downstairs. I had just gotten off an exhausting 5 a.m. shift at the hospital, my hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic, and all I wanted was to crawl into bed and forget the world. But I had a nagging feeling that day, the kind that sits in your chest and refuses to let you breathe properly. I didn't know it yet, but that feeling was the prelude to the unraveling of my life, or at least the version of it I thought I knew. Her name was Emily Grace Watson, born September 12, 1990, a little over a year older than me. She had this uncanny way of making you feel like the center of her universe while somehow making the universe feel small. When we met in 2014, it was at a mutual friend's Halloween party in Cambridge. I had been fresh out of med school, still fumbling with my white coat and my new responsibilities at Massachusetts General Hospital. And Emily was working at a quirky little independent bookstore called Bound and Found. She had this laugh, this spontaneous, reckless laugh that made everyone around her a little lighter, a little less anchored to their boring, safe lives. We moved in together in 2016, a cozy, sunlit apartment on Beacon Street. Hardwood floors that creaked in the middle of the night, windows that never quite closed properly, and a balcony that overlooked a tiny park where kids played soccer every Saturday. We had routines, predictable and comfortable. Every morning, I'd brew coffee while she played her old vinyl records Fleetwood Mac. Adele, the occasional Arctic Monkeys track when she wanted something more reckless. We'd eat breakfast together, her soft brown eyes occasionally lingering on me a second too long, and I'd feel this warm, stupid kind of happiness, the one that makes you forget everything else. Looking back, I realize how easy it was to be blind, how easy it was to ignore the subtle cues tucked into the corners of daily life. The way she sometimes held her phone a little too tight, or how she'd run out for errands just a little more often than necessary. I'd see her texting late at night and think nothing of it. I trusted her with everything, my entire messy heart, because love, or at least the version I thought I understood, didn't come with built-in suspicion. The morning that changed everything started in October. I had woken up earlier than usual again. Hospital shift fatigue made my sleep light and fragmented. Dan noticed her purse was on the counter unzipped. Normally, I'd never pry. That was sacred territory. But for some reason, that day, a small flicker of curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it was the lingering tension from a tiny argument we'd had over dinner the night before. She'd accused me of being distant, and I had muttered something about needing space. As if I could bottle my exhaustion and leave it on a shelf somewhere, I knelt down to grab my keys, and a stack of folded papers fell out from the deep pocket of her bag. I caught them instinctively, heart thudding, and froze. The papers weren't bills, grocery lists, or mundane receipts. They were letters handwritten in looping, elegant handwriting that wasn't hers. I remember the first one I unfolded, the paper soft and slightly yellowed, the ink smudged in places, as though it had been carried around for a long time, hidden and secret. The top letter was addressed to her, and as I read the first line, something in my chest constricted like a steel band tightening around my ribs. Every time I see you, I lose a little more of myself. My stomach dropped a cold, sickening weight. I glanced at the signature at the bottom. It wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone I knew. I remember the surreal thought that flickered through my mind. The absurd, impossible hope. Maybe it was just a journal entry, a fictional note she wrote to herself. But the next letter shattered that illusion. Same handwriting, same tone, raw, intimate, desperate. I can't tell him yet, but he has no idea. If he ever knew, I don't know what would happen. My hands shook. I could hear the rain now pounding against the windows, relentless and echoing the turmoil inside me. The letters spilled out in a cascade, each one more revealing than the last. A chronicle of secret meetings, hidden affection, promises whispered in darkness, things I had never been a part of. The world around me tilted, like the floor had been yanked from beneath my feet. I sat there for what felt like hours, reading, rereading, trying to convince myself that it was some cruel mistake, some bizarre coincidence. But the evidence was meticulous. Every date, every place she mentioned matched our timelines perfectly, except in ways that deliberately excluded me. I could almost see her smiling that smile, the one I thought was just for me, and now I realized it had been split, shared with someone I didn't know. It's strange how quickly your brain starts rewiring itself in moments like these. I remember the cold clarity that came over me, the sudden, invasive questioning of everything I had ever taken for granted. The nights we had spent together, the vacations, the quiet Sunday mornings, were they all just borrowed time, a performance, and that sinking, twisting thought. How long had this been going on? Before that day, I had been careful with my heart. I'd been cautious, aware that vulnerability is dangerous, that giving too much too soon can burn you alive. And yet, I had thrown caution away for Emily. I had believed in her, fully and without reservation, and in return, she had concealed pieces of herself that now felt like knives in my chest. I couldn't breathe properly, couldn't stop the images of her in my mind. Coffee cups in our kitchen, the smell of her hair after she showered, her laughter echoing against the walls of our tiny apartment, every memory now tainted with suspicion, betrayal, and grief. The rain kept hitting the window, rhythmic, unrelenting, as though the universe itself was pounding the truth into me, demanding that I confront the reality I had refused to see. I sat there until the letters were neatly stacked beside me, my mind racing. I thought about calling her, confronting her, screaming, crying, begging for an explanation. But a part of me, a quieter, more calculating part, whispered that I shouldn't, that whatever answer I got might destroy me further. So I stayed in that awful, suspended moment, aware that nothing would ever feel the same again. And yet, there was a strange, almost perverse clarity that came with that discovery. I saw the small cracks in our relationship. I had ignored the late-night texts she would defend as were the subtle distance in her eyes during family gatherings, the way she sometimes seemed lost in thought, distracted. Now, they weren't small cracks. They were fissures, and they had been there all along. I remember walking to the window and looking out over the park below. The kids were still playing soccer, oblivious to the adult dramas unfolding above them. The clouds had thickened, heavy and gray, a mirror to the storm raging inside me. I realized then that life doesn't give you warning signs for heartache. There's no blinking light, no alarm, no instruction manual. You just live it. And then, one day, everything you thought you knew can turn into a question mark. That morning, with the letters in my hand, I knew something fundamental had shifted. I didn't know yet what I would do, or how I would navigate the aftermath, but I knew that the woman I had loved with my whole being was not the woman I thought she was. And in that realization, there was terror, grief, and a strange, hollow sense of inevitability. I sat there until the rain slowed, until the edges of the sky began to lighten just slightly, and tried to imagine the next steps. I kept the letters in a drawer, careful not to touch them again, at least for the moment. Part of me wanted to erase them, burn them, pretend this had never happened. Another part of me knew that, whatever I chose, the knowledge was already a part of me, a shadow I would carry forever. And so, that's where it began, the unraveling, the suspicion, the heartbreak. That morning, in our little sunlit apartment in Brookline, the story of Emily and me, the story I thought I knew, started to fracture. And I had no idea that this was only the beginning of a series of revelations that would force me to question not just her, but myself, the people around me, and the fragile illusion of trust we cling to in love. The days after I found the letters were a blur, like wading through fog while the world carried on around me in sharp, cruel clarity. I tried to act normal, smile, sip coffee, watch Emily scroll on her phone, but every laugh, every glance felt like a knife twisting in my gut. October 22nd, 2018 was the first Sunday after that discovery. I had taken the day off from the hospital, telling myself I needed time to think, but in reality, I was spiraling into a storm I didn't know how to navigate. That Emily moved around the apartment like nothing had changed. She hummed while tidying up, occasionally glancing at me with that easy, radiant smile that had once made me feel untouchable. And yet, with each glance, I saw a flicker of something else, in unfamiliar tension, a hesitation she hadn't meant for me to notice. My mind replayed the letters over and over, the words, the dates, the intimate confessions, the hidden meetings. There was one letter in particular, from August 2018, that hit me hardest. It described a quiet coffee shop near Harvard Square, a secluded corner table, a hand brushing hers. The thrill of not being caught. Reading it made my chest feel like it had been hollowed out. I remembered walking her past that same cafe a week later, thinking she was just window shopping, completely unaware that someone else had already claimed that space in her heart. I couldn't sleep. Every night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining scenarios, conversations, confrontations. My mind, usually so methodical and rational as a doctor, betrayed me. I found myself scrutinizing her messages, her tone, her laugh, wondering if I had missed the subtle signs, and in that obsessive, exhausting replaying of events, I realized the bitter truth. I had been living alongside a stranger, someone who had learned to smile for me while keeping her heart elsewhere. On October 24, 2018, I finally reached my breaking point. I had been at work, doing rounds, injecting patients with antibiotics, checking vitals, all the while replaying in my head the August letter again. Emily had texted me, "Hope you're having a good day," and I needed to scream at her. Not just because of what she had done, but because of the way she had hidden it so well. I remember sitting in the break room, the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with instant coffee, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to steady myself. I thought about confronting her right there, at home, in the safety of our apartment, but I didn't. Fear held me back, not fear of her, but fear of the unknown. Fear of confirming that the person I loved was indeed capable of deceiving me so thoroughly. That night, I made a decision. I would follow her. Not in a creepy, obsessive way, or at least that wasn't my intention at first. I wanted to see, to know. I needed to understand the depth of what I had stumbled upon. I parked 2 blocks away from the apartment at 8 p.m., pretending to read emails on my phone. I waited, heart hammering in my chest, every pedestrian and car passing by feeling like a potential revelation. At 8:45, she left. Dressed in a loose beige coat, her hair tucked behind one ear, she looked ordinary, domestic, completely unaware that someone I trusted had transformed into a stranger. Overnight, Emily walked briskly through the drizzle, her umbrella barely shielding her from the rain. I followed at a safe distance, my eyes tracking her every movement. She turned down streets I didn't recognize as part of our usual routine. Then, she stopped in front of a nondescript apartment building near Alston, pressed the buzzer for the second floor, and disappeared inside. My pulse raced. I parked around the corner, taking a moment to breathe. I could hear my thoughts ricocheting in my skull. Is this the person from the letters? Does she live here with someone else? I waited an hour. Nothing happened. Finally, I walked closer, hiding in the shadows, and saw movement inside. Through the frosted glass of a window, a man appeared, tall, dark-haired, older than me by a few years. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his presence felt intimate, familiar, as though he belonged there with her, and she belonged there with him, not me, not the world I had carefully built with her. The confrontation, when it finally happened, wasn't dramatic in a movie sense. It was mundane, terrifyingly so. She came home at 11:30 p.m., dripping wet, her face pale, and I waited in the hallway like a ghost, holding the letters I had already memorized. "Emily," I said, voice barely above a whisper. She froze. Her eyes widened, the smile faltering, and then she said nothing. I felt my chest tighten, a strange hollow ache that spread through every nerve. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to demand explanations, but instead, I just stood there, shaking, staring at the woman I had loved with everything. Realizing in that instant that love alone couldn't shield you from betrayal, she finally spoke after what felt like an eternity. The words were careful, measured, apologies, confessions, excuses, words I had longed for in my dreams but dreaded in reality. The letters were real, she admitted. The man was real. And yes, she had wanted to tell me eventually, but she had been afraid. Afraid of losing me, afraid of confrontation, afraid of the shattering aftermath she now had no choice but to confront. I remember the mix of emotions that hit me like a freight train: grief, rage, disbelief, shame, and, strangely, relief. Relief because I finally knew the truth. Relief because the uncertainty, the gnawing suspicion that had been slowly eating me alive, was gone. But relief didn't temper the pain. It didn't fill the hollow ache where trust used to reside in the following days. I barely ate, barely slept, barely functioned. work became mechanical. Every patient I saw, every four I inserted, every chart I updated felt like I was performing while my soul was ripped apart behind the scenes. I caught glimpses of Emily on the days we still crossed paths at home. She moved carefully, guilt etched in the lines of her face, trying to navigate a life that had suddenly become impossible. And I realized something terrifying. The person I loved, the life I had built, the trust I had given freely, was now fractured beyond repair. I became obsessed with understanding everything: why, how long, and who. I reread the letters, tracing the dates, piecing together the timeline. Late nights in the apartment became common, staring at the rain-streaked windows, feeling like a man trapped in a cage of betrayal. Memories that had once brought joy now twisted into daggers. Her laugh in the kitchen, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, even the smell of her shampoo, ordinary detail. Now a haunting reminder, and there were moments of self-blame. What had I missed? Was I too trusting? Too naive? Had I been blind in ways I couldn't forgive myself for? I felt the slow creep of bitterness, not just toward her, but toward myself, toward love itself. The realization was suffocating. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. And the person who had promised you honesty could, in an instant, become a stranger you share a life with. By the end of that week, I knew things had changed irreversibly. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage of memory and betrayal. Emily tried to talk to me, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I understood how I could exist in the same space as someone who had hidden an entire life from me. And deep down, I understood that this was only the beginning. The breaking point had arrived, and the fallout was about to begin. The days after confronting Emily were worse than I could have imagined. October bled into November, the city around me growing colder. The streets slick with rain and leaves, and inside our apartment, everything felt heavier. The air was thick with unsaid words, tension, and the smell of burnt coffee I could never quite get right anymore. I had expected arguments, tears, maybe even a confrontation that would explode in violence or catharsis. Instead, there was a hollow silence. The kind of silence that mocks you, that whispers, "You're not enough, not anymore." I barely recognized myself. I went to work, did my rounds, and performed my duties with mechanical precision. But the person I had once been, the one who laughed with patience, who stayed up talking with interns about the absurdities of life, who loved with a reckless abandon, was gone. I caught myself staring at my reflection in the stainless steel of an IV pole, seeing dark circles under my eyes, the tightness around my jaw, the cold hardness in my chest that hadn't been there before. I thought of Emily constantly. I wondered how she could be so calm, so collected, after the devastation she'd caused. Did she feel anything? Did she even regret it? Friends began noticing. I remember sitting at a dimly lit pub near Harvard Square with Alex, my closest friend since med school. He asked me how I was, and for the first time, I couldn't give him an answer. Not a real one. I managed to nod, mutter some vague words about being tired, about work. But he knew. He always knew. Alex had this ability to read me, to sense when I was breaking, even before I understood it myself. He didn't pry, not at first. He just ordered another round of beers and let me sit there, staring into the amber liquid, wondering if I would ever feel whole again. Home was unbearable. Every object, every corner of our apartment, screamed reminders. The letters were gone. I had hidden them in a box at the back of the closet, but I could still feel them, the ghost of their words lingering in my mind. Emily tried to initiate conversation, but I recoiled. Even seeing her move around the kitchen, making tea with careful precision, filled me with a bitter mix of longing and rage. There were moments I wanted to reach out, to beg her to tell me why, to confess that I still loved her despite everything. And then, in the next heartbeat, I wanted to scream, to throw every fragile piece of furniture against the walls, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain I carried in silence. It wasn't just the emotional toll. Physically, I began losing weight, barely eating, existing on coffee and toast. Nights became endless stretches of insomnia. I would lie awake listening to the rain, replaying the letters, imagining her with him. The words she had never said to me but had written for someone else. My mind became a trap, a looping nightmare I couldn't escape from. Family tried to help. My younger sister Mia called me nearly every day. "Shubham, "Are you okay?" she would ask, her voice trembling with worry. I hated lying to her, but I couldn't tell her the truth not yet. Not the messy, raw, unbearable truth of betrayal. I muttered vague reassurances, promised I was fine. Even as I crumpled into the bed at night, gripping my pillow, tasting the metallic tang of tears I didn't even allow myself to shed in front of anyone else. Work became a refuge, but also a source of guilt. Patients smiled at me, trusted me, and yet I felt like a fraud. How could I advise, care, or comfort anyone when I myself was unraveling? I remember one night, late in November, administering a sedative to a young boy in the ICU, his small hand clutching mine. He looked up at me with trust so pure, and for a moment, the world felt almost right. But then I thought of Emily, of the hidden letters, of the lies, and the weight returned. Pressing against my chest like a physical force, I hated that I felt my own suffering overshadow everything else. Emily's presence became both unbearable and magnetic. I couldn't stop watching her, trying to gauge her mood, trying to detect any sign of regret or guilt. It was like trying to read a book that had suddenly been rewritten in a language I didn't understand. Sometimes late at night, I would hear her typing on her laptop. A soft, rhythmic tapping that once felt comforting, but now sounded like a code I could never decipher. The apartment was no longer a shared home. It was a minefield, each step fraught with tension. And then came the social fallout. Mutual friends, once a source of joy, became minefields themselves. Some knew, some didn't, and I couldn't bring myself to ask who was in on the secret. I felt isolated, like I had stepped off a familiar path and found myself wandering through a cold, unmarked forest. Holidays loomed: Thanksgiving, Christmas, and I dreaded the thought of gathering around tables, forcing smiles while my world quietly collapsed at work. Rumors began to reach me in small, cutting fragments. Emily's name whispered in connection to another man, though no one knew the full story. The ambiguity was torturous. I wanted clarity, confrontation, justice, and yet I feared the consequences. Part of me craved revenge, not violence, but exposure, truth laid bare. Another part of me simply wanted to vanish, to escape the relentless ache of knowing someone I loved so deeply had betrayed me in ways I couldn't undo. Sleep became erratic. I started having dreams, sometimes vivid, sometimes nightmarish, where Emily was standing across the room with him, laughing, smiling at something I couldn't see. I would wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, clutching at the empty sheets beside me, remembering that she was, in reality, there beside me. In the same bed we once shared trust in, the cognitive dissonance was unbearable. My own mind became a battlefield, with one side pleading for understanding, forgiveness, and the other screaming in anguish, betrayal, and disbelief. By mid-December, I realized I was at a tipping point. I had stopped eating properly, lost nearly 10 pounds, and found myself withdrawing from friends, family, and work alike. Even casual conversations felt impossible. Emily attempted reconciliation in small, tentative ways: coffee on the balcony, careful smiles, soft apologies, but I couldn't accept them. The letters, the betrayal, the hidden life she had led were imprinted into my memory like scars. They couldn't be erased, and every attempt at normalcy felt like self-deception. One night, I found myself wandering the streets of Boston, the cold air biting at my cheeks, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I didn't have a destination. I just walked, letting the turmoil inside me mirror the chaotic streets around me. I passed couples holding hands, laughing, completely oblivious to the kind of heartbreak I was drowning in. And I realized something. I didn't just feel betrayed by Emily, I felt betrayed by love itself, by the human capacity to hurt those we claim to cherish the most. I started writing in a journal, desperately trying to make sense of the chaos. Page after page of thoughts, emotions, and memories spilled out in a torrent of raw, unfiltered pain. I documented every letter, every lie, every moment of quiet suspicion I had once dismissed. Writing didn't heal me. Not really, but it gave form to the shapeless anguish, a small lifeline in the storm. By January 2019, the fallout had solidified. Emily and I weren't divorced, technically, but we were ghosts in the same apartment. We existed alongside each other in silence, negotiating meals, schedules, and interactions as though we were strangers forced into proximity. Friends drifted away, sensing the tension, unable to navigate the unspoken minefield. Family offered support, but I couldn't let them in completely. The shame of betrayal, the humiliation of loving someone so completely, only to have it hidden away, weighed too heavily. And through it all, one truth became undeniable. The world I thought I knew, the life I had built, had been irrevocably altered. I was no longer the same man who had laughed with Emily on Beacon Street, who believed in love with reckless abandon. Something inside me had hardened, a protective shell forged in grief, betrayal, and the slow, grinding realization that some people are capable of loving in halves, of hiding whole lives behind smiles, letters, and whispered lies. The fallout wasn't just emotional, it was existential. Every interaction, every memory, every ordinary, mundane detail carried the weight of her betrayal. And yet, beneath all the pain, beneath the rage and grief, a seed began to form. A quiet, almost imperceptible resolve that I couldn't allow this story to end in ruin. I didn't know yet how I would channel it into confrontation, healing, or something darker. But I knew the world wouldn't let me remain broken forever. By February 2019, I had reached a crossroads. The months of fallout had carved deep lines into my face, hollowed my eyes, and worn my patience down to brittle splinters. For a long time, I had been stuck in paralysis watching Emily move around our shared apartment like a stranger, replaying the letters, the hidden meetings, the stolen moments endlessly. But something shifted inside me that month, something quiet but insistent, like a pulse beneath my ribs. I realized I could no longer exist as a passive victim of this betrayal. If I didn't take control of my life, the weight of her secrets would crush me entirely. It started small. I began with myself. I re-established routines I had abandoned during the fallout, the early morning runs along the Charles River. But unlike before, these routines weren't just about survival. They were about reclaiming a sense of self, a sense of power over the chaos that had invaded my life. Each step I ran along the wet pavement, each patient I cared for with renewed attention, each word I wrote in my journal, became a defiance against the paralysis Emily had unknowingly cast upon me. But reclaiming myself was only the beginning. I needed clarity. I needed answers, not just the surface-level truths she had reluctantly offered during our confrontation, but the full scope of her secret life. This required observation, patience, and a measure of cunning I had never imagined myself capable of. I started keeping notes, small observations about her habits, her routines, her digital presence, and occasional patterns I had missed. I wasn't trying to stalk her out of obsession. I was documenting reality, gathering the pieces of a puzzle that had been forced upon me without my consent. One night, I decided to access her email carefully, without malice in mind, only a need to understand. What I discovered was staggering. Hidden accounts, drafts of letters, messages to the man I had glimpsed in Alston, discussions of meetings, plans, and feelings she had never intended me to see. I sat in our dimly lit apartment, fingers trembling over the keyboard, heart pounding like a drum in my chest, feeling a mixture of rage, relief, and strange empowerment. The truth, finally, was fully mine to hold. And in holding it, I felt a spark of control ignite. But control alone wasn't enough. I needed confrontation on my terms. I couldn't allow the narrative to be dictated solely by her secrecy. I planned carefully, meticulously. I wrote down questions I needed answered, evidence I wanted acknowledged, boundaries I was ready to set. And I realized something. This wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. This was about reclaiming agency, about asserting that my love, my trust, my heart could not be violated without consequence. By March, I started setting subtle boundaries. I refused to share meals without discussion, refused to engage in conversations that skirted around the truth. Each act, small as it seemed, was a reclaiming of dignity, a quiet statement that I would no longer be invisible in my own life. Emily noticed. She tried to deflect, to charm, to guilt, but I had grown sharper. Each attempt she made to manipulate the fragile remnants of our shared existence was met with calm, measured resistance. The power dynamic was shifting. I also began opening up in selective ways. Alex, my closest friend, became a sounding board again. I shared the layers of discovery with him, not to revel in bitterness, but to process, to strategize, to feel less alone. He listened, offered insight, and reminded me that the ultimate goal wasn't revenge, was liberation. That idea resonated with me. Liberation from deceit, from manipulation, from the feeling that my world had been hijacked without consent. April brought action. I requested a meeting with Emily, not an argument, not a confrontation fueled by anger, but a deliberate, controlled discussion. I laid out everything I had found, the letters, the hidden accounts, the timeline of deceit. I described the emotional toll, the isolation, the grief, and the betrayal. And then I waited, observing her reactions carefully. Fear, guilt, shame flickered across her face, emotions I had once longed to evoke in vain. But now, I wasn't seeking an apology to soothe my pain. I was asserting reality, demanding acknowledgement, reclaiming my narrative, the conversation, or rather, the careful, deliberate confrontation. For the first time since October, there was honesty, however forced, in the room. Emily admitted details I hadn't yet uncovered, explanations I hadn't anticipated, truths she had buried beneath fear and shame. And I listened it because I wanted to forgive immediately, but because understanding was a weapon in itself. Knowledge gave me power. Power gave me choice. Choice gave me freedom. I started to transform emotionally as well. The anger, the grief, and the betrayal didn't vanish, but they evolved. I redirected them into self-empowerment. I immersed myself in my work, not as an escape, but as a reclamation of competence and purpose. I cultivated small joys, morning runs, evenings in cafes, discovering new books, reconnecting with friends who had drifted away during the months of fallout. I realized that my life, despite the rupture caused by Emily's betrayal, was still mine to reclaim, reshape, and redefine. I also confronted moral dilemmas. Part of me, deeply wounded, wanted to expose her, to let the world see the dual life she had led. But I resisted. I realized that my growth didn't require her humiliation. My power didn't need to be measured by someone else's shame. The act of reclaiming my agency, asserting my boundaries, and choosing how to respond to betrayal was the ultimate statement. It was quiet, internal, and devastatingly effective. By late spring, the apartment no longer felt like a prison. It was a space still shared with Emily, but I no longer lived in fear or paralysis. I had learned to navigate the tension, to assert my needs, and to extract myself emotionally from the chaos she had introduced. There were moments of sorrow, of lingering attachment, but they no longer dictated my existence. I had reclaimed the narrative, piece by piece, letter by letter, confrontation by confrontation, and in that reclamation, a transformation occurred. I became more discerning in my relationships, more vigilant of my own emotional boundaries, and more committed to self-preservation. I realized that love, trust, and betrayal are not purely abstract concepts. They are forces that can shape, warp, and ultimately define the trajectory of your life. By asserting control over the aftermath, I had begun to redirect those forces toward growth rather than destruction. The turning point wasn't cinematic, dramatic in the traditional sense. There was no grand confrontation on the street, no explosive revelation broadcast to the world. It was quiet, measured, almost imperceptible, but it was devastatingly effective. I was no longer the man paralyzed by betrayal. I was a man who understood the value of control, agency, and deliberate action. And that understanding, that reclamation of self, became the foundation for what would follow the resolution of a story I had once feared would have no ending at all. By summer 2019, the apartment on Beacon Street had shifted once again. Not back to what it had been, never that, but into a space defined by a fragile equilibrium. Emily and I existed in proximity, not intimacy. Our interactions were functional, occasionally polite, but stripped of the illusions that had once painted over the fractures. The letters, the hidden accounts, the secret meetings, they no longer dictated my every thought. They were memories, painful and raw, but contained. Like shards of glass I had learned to handle without bleeding. I had transformed in ways I hadn't anticipated. I no longer felt the gnawing, paralyzing obsession that had followed me through rainy nights and endless city walks. Instead, I had learned to channel the ache into something constructive: my work, my friendships, my own inner world. I reconnected with Alex, with Mia, with old colleagues I had distanced myself from. Conversations were deeper, more honest, unafraid of vulnerability. And in that, I found a renewed sense of strength, a resilience I hadn't known existed within me. Emily attempted to bridge the gap. Small gestures, a cup of coffee left on the counter, a tentative smile, casual conversation. I met these cautiously, aware that forgiveness wasn't a requirement for coexistence, and that trust, once broken, cannot simply be rebuilt with good intentions. I realized that reconciliation, in the traditional sense, was not the goal. My goal was equilibrium, the ability to live in the world I had built, free from the control of her secrets, free from the illusion that my life could be dictated by betrayal. There were moments of reflection that came late at night, when the city lights filtered through the thin curtains, and I sat at my desk, journal open, pen in hand. I thought about the man from Alston, the letters, the months of sleepless nights. I thought about the way betrayal had stripped me bare, and how, paradoxically, that exposure had forced me to grow stronger. The emotional excavation, as painful as it had been, revealed a resilience I hadn't credited myself with. I realized that the greatest power I could possess was the ability to reclaim my narrative, to define my own responses to the chaos life throws at you. One evening, in late August, I walked along the Charles River, the air warm with the lingering touch of summer. The water reflected the orange and pink of the setting sun. Children's laughter carried faintly on the breeze, couples holding hands, oblivious to the private wars that sometimes raged in the hearts of those nearby, and I understood, with a clarity that startled me, that I was no longer the man trapped in the aftermath of Emily's betrayal. I was a man who had been tested, broken, and painstakingly rebuilt. The letters remained hidden, tucked away in a box at the back of the closet. I never burned them, never destroyed them. They were artifacts of a painful chapter, reminders not of shame but of growth. I revisited them occasionally, not to relive the hurt, but to acknowledge the journey from devastation to reclamation, from helplessness to control. They had shaped me, irrevocably, but they did not define me. I also began to imagine a future independent of Emily. I pictured a life where love, if it came again, would be tempered by caution and wisdom, informed by the lessons of betrayal, but not imprisoned by them. I thought about career goals I had postponed, friendships I had neglected, adventures I had deferred. The world felt wider, possibilities more tangible. Because I had survived the crucible of heartbreak and emerged, not broken, but wiser, stronger, and more self-aware. Emily and I eventually agreed on a separation, not with shouting, or recrimination, or a dramatic climax, but with quiet acknowledgement. We divided possessions, responsibilities, and routines. The process was meticulous, almost clinical. But beneath that careful organization, there was an unspoken understanding. We had loved, we had hurt, we had survived. And now, we were moving forward separately, but with the knowledge that the past, however painful, need not dictate the future. There were still moments, fleeting and sharp, when memories stabbed at me, her laugh in the kitchen, the touch of her hand, the scent of her shampoo, but they no longer commanded my life. I had learned to contextualize pain, to recognize that suffering, while inevitable, could be harnessed, processed, and ultimately transformed. I had learned that betrayal, as devastating as it is, need not be terminal. It can be a crucible, a test of endurance, and a catalyst for profound personal evolution. By September 2019, a year since the discovery of the letters, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't imagined possible. Not a naive, blissful peace, but a grounded, hard-earned serenity. I had learned to trust myself, to set boundaries, and to approach life with eyes wide open, wary but not cynical. And in that, I discovered a freedom that no betrayal, no secret, no hidden letter could ever take away. Looking back now, I realized that the letters, the hidden life, the months of heartbreak, they were not just acts of betrayal. They were mirrors, reflecting not only Emily's choices, but my own capacity to endure, adapt, and rise. I had been broken, yes, but I had also been rebuilt, piece by piece, stronger, wiser, and unafraid. And in that final realization, I understood the most important truth of all. Life does not stop for heartbreak. Life does not pause for betrayal. It moves forward relentlessly, and those who survive, who face the storm, and choose to reclaim their narrative, are the ones who discover what it truly means to be alive. I walked away from that chapter with scars, yes, but also with clarity, agency, and a newfound respect for the power of resilience. Emily's hidden life had once threatened to undo me, but instead it had taught me to rise. And in rising, I found something unshakable: myself.